My husband once looked me in the eye and said he'd rather kiss a dog than me. Stay with me till the end. Maybe you'll understand how one sentence can turn love into ashes. That night is still carved into my memory. I had spent hours cooking his favorite meal, pepper shrimp pasta, the one he used to beg me to make when we were dating. I lit candles, played soft music, even wore the gold dress he once said made me look like sunlight. It had been months since we'd had a real evening together, and I thought maybe, just maybe, this could remind us who we were before success made him a stranger. Julian walked in late, smelling faintly of a perfume that wasn't mine. His tie hung loose, his expression tired but arrogant. He gave me that quick half-smile that never reached his eyes anymore. I asked him to sit. I poured him a glass of wine, tried to make small talk about his new project, the one he called his empire in the making. He grunted a few replies, more interested in his phone than me. When I reached across the table and touched his hand, he looked up, not with warmth but with disgust. "What are you doing, Amara?" he asked, pulling back. My heart stumbled. "I'm just trying to be close again," I said softly. He laughed, that cold, hollow laugh that made the room shrink. Then he said it. "I'd rather kiss a dog than you." The world went still. My throat burned, but no tears came. He pushed his chair back, tossed his napkin onto the table, and walked away like he'd just discussed the weather. I sat there, staring at the flickering candles, listening to the slow sound of my heart breaking. For years, I'd been his biggest supporter. The woman who helped design his first office, who stayed up editing contracts when he couldn't afford staff, who believed in him when no one else did. And now I was a burden, a punchline in his cruel joke. When I finally blew out the candles, I realized something inside me had gone silent. Not dead, just quiet. That's when it started. Not the revenge, not yet. Just the watching, the noticing, the pretending. As I washed the dishes, his words replayed in my head like a curse. But beneath the hurt, something else began to stir, calm, deliberate, sharp. He thought he had broken me that night. What he didn't know was that he had just created the woman who would one day take everything he built and leave him with nothing but his own pride. And as I wiped the last plate dry, I whispered to myself, "You'll remember this dinner, Julian. One day, you'll remember every word." After that night, silence became our language. Julian no longer bothered to hide his distance. He left early, came home late, and always smelled faintly of a scent I didn't own, something floral and expensive. The first time I asked about it, he laughed and said, "Maybe you should try wearing better perfume." I smiled faintly, pretending it didn't sting. I learned fast that questions only led to insults. He started taking calls in the hallway or stepping outside mid-conversation, his voice low and sharp. Once, I walked into the kitchen and caught him whispering, "She doesn't suspect anything." He froze when he saw me, then laughed like it was a joke. "Business, Amara. You wouldn't understand." I nodded, pretending I didn't. But inside, something twisted, not from pain, but awakening. My work, the thing I loved most, became another weapon he used against me. I'm a freelance interior designer, and I had just landed a small but promising project. When I excitedly told Julian, he didn't even look up from his tablet. "That's cute," he said. "Still playing decorator, huh?" That word, playing, sat heavy in my chest. To him, my dreams were child's play, a distraction from his empire. But I didn't argue. I started saving my invoices, printing contracts, collecting everything I could. I learned to move quietly, like a shadow in my own home. At night, when he fell asleep on the couch with his phone half hidden under a pillow, I would glance through it just long enough to note the new names, the late-night texts, the emails marked private. I didn't confront him. I simply remembered. Every password, every contact, every date that didn't add up. Julian became crueler with time. Not in the loud, obvious way, but in the slow erosion of respect. He mocked the way I dressed, the meals I cooked, the way I laughed. "You've changed, Amara," he'd say, as if it were an accusation. And maybe I had. I was no longer the woman who begged for love. I was learning to listen to the silence between his lies. One evening, he came home furious. A deal had fallen through, and he needed someone to blame. "You don't know what pressure is," he snapped. "You sit at home all day, rearranging pillows." I said nothing. I just watched him, the veins in his neck, the arrogance in his voice, the man who thought I'd always take it. When he finally stormed upstairs, I opened my laptop and began saving documents from our shared drive. Contracts, business plans, client lists. Everything he'd ever underestimated me enough to share. My hands didn't shake. My breath didn't quicken. I just worked quietly and steadily, while his footsteps thudded above me. He thought I was too weak to fight. But I wasn't fighting. Not yet. I was learning. Every crack, every flaw, every secret. Because marble may look flawless, but once it starts to crack, it can never be whole again. Her name came to me like a whisper I wasn't meant to hear. Ivy Carver. I saw it first on a restaurant receipt tucked in Julian's jacket pocket. The date matched the night he told me he had a late client dinner. The receipt was for two, an expensive wine I didn't recognize and a dessert he never ordered when he was with me. At the bottom, written in neat cursive, was a note. You make business taste sweeter. I stared at the handwriting for a long time, my stomach tight but my face calm. It wasn't shock anymore, it was confirmation. The invisible pieces I'd been collecting finally began to fit together. The perfume, the phone calls, the sudden new mentee, in real estate he mentioned casually. He said her name once, weeks ago, while bragging about helping young talent in the industry. I remembered because he'd used that same proud tone he once used for me. A few days later, I heard her voice for the first time. It was early morning. Julian was pacing the kitchen, phone pressed to his ear, unaware I was standing just down the hall. Ivy, he said softly, the way he used to say my name. Then her laughter came through the speaker, light, flirtatious, with that practiced sweetness women use when they know they have power. I froze, listening to him promise her things he hadn't promised me in years. A new car, a spot on a project, a trip for networking. He laughed, low and familiar, and my stomach turned. When he ended the call, I stepped back quietly, letting the mask of ignorance slide back over my face. I didn't cry this time. I made tea, smiled when he entered the room, and asked if he wanted breakfast. He said no, kissed the top of my head absently, and left. The moment the door closed, I opened my laptop and began searching. Ivy Carver, 29, licensed real estate agent, Atlanta. Southern background, grew up in Savannah. Her social profiles painted her as bubbly and ambitious, the kind of woman who believed charm could open any door. I studied her like a case file, the projects she'd worked on, her clients, her posts about mentorship. She loved attention. She loved validation. And she loved Julian's world, the expensive suits, the champagne events, the illusion of being chosen. Every detail I gathered felt like a brick stacking quietly in the wall I was building around myself. Not for protection, but preparation. I started saving screenshots, printing receipts, and noting every connection between them. Julian thought I was blind. He didn't realize I'd learned to see without looking. I stopped reacting. I started calculating. When I caught sight of them together weeks later at one of his business lunches, her hand brushing his sleeve, her smile too bright, I didn't flinch. I just watched, invisible in plain sight. He had his mistress. I had my patience. And patience, I was learning, could be deadlier than anger. I woke up one morning and decided to stop being the wounded wife. If Julian wanted to believe I was defeated, then that would be my disguise. I began to play the role he expected, the quiet, agreeable partner who smiled at dinners and asked no questions. My silence became my weapon. Every morning, I dressed with intention. Sharp lines, soft colors, confidence stitched into every seam. I started wearing the perfume he once said was too strong. I laughed at his shallow jokes, touched his arm at events, and acted as if his indifference didn't cut me. He thought he'd won. He thought I was trying to win him back. But really, I was buying time. He began to let his guard down again. That was his mistake. I noticed how relaxed he became when he thought I'd stopped paying attention. How he left files open on the counter. How he bragged over dinner about his growing network. I encouraged him to talk, nodding and smiling as I stored every word in my memory. When he was away on one of his so-called business trips, I made my first real move. I reached out to my cousin, Chibuzo. Everyone called him Bo. He was calm, smart, and had the kind of mind that could see through any contract. I didn't tell him everything at once. Just enough for him to understand I needed legal precision. We met late in his office downtown, the city lights reflecting against the glass walls. "You sure about this, Amara?" he asked quietly, scanning one of Julian's company documents. "Once we start digging, we can't go back." I looked him in the eye and said, "Bo, I'm not digging to destroy him. I'm digging to free myself." Bo started tracing Julian's business structure. On paper, everything looked clean, but underneath there were layers of shell companies, hidden transfers, and off-the-record deals. The kind of things only someone who believed he was untouchable would do. We mapped it all out. Slowly. Carefully. At home, I acted normal. I cooked, I smiled, I listened. When Julian mentioned a new deal, I asked innocent questions, the kind that made him underestimate me even more. That's amazing, babe. How do you even keep track of all your partners? I'd say, and he'd grin, proud to show off. Pride made him careless. While he slept, I copied documents, photographed ledgers, and sent them to Beau. We built a quiet archive, the blueprint of the empire I would one day break. Every file, every number, every hidden account became another thread in my web. Julian didn't see it coming because he was too busy watching himself in the mirror. He saw a broken wife standing beside him, not realizing she was studying the cracks in his reflection. And as I watched him drift deeper into his own arrogance, I knew it was only a matter of time before the quiet became the storm. The night of the gala shimmered with everything Julian loved: power, luxury, attention. The ballroom was drenched in gold light, with the words Brooks Estates displayed across the massive screens like a crown on his ego. Cameras flashed, champagne flowed, and Julian moved through the crowd like a king greeting his subjects. And me? I was his queen, the perfect picture of grace, standing right where he wanted me, beside him, smiling. I wore an emerald silk gown, the color he once said brought out my eyes. Tonight, it wasn't for him. It was armor. I slipped my arm through his, matching his confidence with quiet poise. Every time he introduced me, I smiled and spoke softly. We're so proud of this project. It's truly Julian's vision come to life. People nodded, impressed by the supportive wife who knew her place. None of them saw the spark behind my calm expression. I had spent the last few weeks carefully spreading whispers, small, believable rumors that traveled like smoke through the business world. Stories about delayed payments, investors not being paid back, questionable expenses hidden in the books. Just enough truth in them to sound credible. Tonight, I made sure those whispers reached the right ears. As waiters glided between the guests, I floated through the room, light and warm. I complimented the wives, laughed at the men's predictable jokes, and leaned in just close enough to say, Julian's been working so hard lately. I just hope he doesn't overextend himself again. I said it kindly, with concern, and then moved on. Words like that linger. Ivy Carver was there too, of course, dressed in silver, pretending to be another member of Julian's team. Her smile faltered every time our eyes met. She didn't expect me to be this calm, this composed. I could see the tension in her jaw, the way she kept checking if anyone was watching her. I almost pitied her. Almost. Julian gave a grand speech on stage, his voice full of pride and ego. He spoke about success, innovation, and trust. The crowd applauded, dazzled by his charm. When he raised his glass to toast his empire, I stepped closer, took the microphone after him, and smiled at the audience. I just want to say, I began, that I've seen every late night, every sleepless hour that went into this. Julian's vision is unmatched, and I know every one of you believes in that as much as I do. I paused, meeting the eyes of a few key investors, the same ones who'd already heard the whispers. Greatness, I continued softly, isn't just about building. It's about keeping everything standing when the ground starts to shake. Polite laughter followed. Julian beamed, thinking I was praising him. But I saw the flicker of unease in a few faces, seeds planted deep, waiting to bloom. The night ended in applause and champagne. Julian thought it was victory. I knew it was poison, sweet, silent, and already working through his empire's veins. It started quietly, the kind of silence that carries tension, like air before a storm. Julian didn't notice at first. He still strutted through the house, still barked orders at his assistants, still kissed his reflection every morning before leaving for work. But I knew. I knew the first thread had snapped. The first sign came when I heard him shouting over the phone in his office. His voice, once smooth and commanding, now cracked with panic. What do you mean the transfer's been delayed? That's impossible. I stayed in the hallway, pretending to dust the table while listening to every word. He slammed the phone down so hard I felt the vibration through the wall. That night, he barely touched his dinner. By the end of the week, 3 of his investors had withdrawn from Brooks Estates. He told me it was a misunderstanding, that the market was just acting weird. But the truth was simpler. They'd heard the whispers. The same whispers I'd planted, watered, and fed with proof. Documents, screenshots, transaction trails. His empire wasn't just cracking, it was caving in. 2 days later, his main account was frozen due to irregularities. He stormed into the kitchen, red-faced, waving a bank statement in the air. Amara, do you have any idea what's happening? He yelled, as if I'd misplaced his wallet instead of his fortune. I looked up from my tea and said softly, "Maybe it's just a system error, love. You know how banks can be." My calmness infuriated him more than any argument could. By the next morning, a lawsuit had surfaced, a small construction firm accusing him of fraud and unpaid contracts. Bo had told me it would hit that week, right on schedule. I didn't have to lift a finger. The evidence we'd gathered was already doing the talking. The company's name splashed across business blogs, the same ones that once praised him as a visionary. Julian's charm began to rot in public. Clients stopped returning his calls. Reporters waited outside his office. His arrogance couldn't hide the cracks anymore. At home, he paced the living room like a caged animal, muttering under his breath, his eyes darting with paranoia. "Someone's sabotaging me," he said. "Someone's feeding lies." He looked at me then, really looked, and for the first time, I saw fear flicker behind his confidence. "You wouldn't know anything about this, would you?" he asked, voice sharp. I smiled faintly. "Me? I barely understand your business, remember?" That night, he threw on his jacket and said he was going to fix things. His voice shook, his hands trembled. I watched him from the window as he stormed into the rain, phone pressed to his ear, shouting into the darkness. The lights of his car disappeared down the street, and I stood there quietly, the faintest smile touching my lips. The mighty Julian Brooks was finally sweating, and I hadn't even started the real strike yet. I found Ivy one cloudy afternoon in a small cafe downtown, the kind of place where people go to hide behind their coffee cups. She didn't see me walk in at first. She was sitting alone by the window, scrolling through her phone, her face pale and drawn. The glow she once had at Julian's events was gone. I took a slow breath and walked toward her table. Her eyes widened when she saw me. "Amara?" she whispered, as if saying my name might summon trouble. I smiled politely and sat down before she could stand. "Relax, Ivy. I'm not here to make a scene." For a few seconds, we just looked at each other. Two women tied to the same man, both fooled by the same charm. I could see the fear in her hands, the way they trembled around her coffee cup. "What do you want?" she finally asked. "I want honesty," I said quietly, "and maybe a little cooperation." She tried to laugh it off, but her voice cracked. "If this is about Julian, I don't." I cut her off gently. "I know about the gifts. The apartment in Midtown. The cash transfers. The trip to Miami last fall. And the baby." Her breath caught. The color drained from her face. She opened her mouth to deny it, then closed it again. The silence between us said everything. "I'm not here to shame you," I continued. "I just want you to understand who you're really dealing with. Julian isn't the man he pretends to be. You think he loves you? He doesn't even love himself. When his empire falls, and it will, you'll be the first name he sacrifices." Her eyes filled with tears. "He told me he'd leave you." He says a lot of things," I said, my tone flat. "But here's what I'm offering. You help me bring the truth to light, every fraudulent deal, every illegal transfer, every fake contract, and I'll make sure your name stays out of the legal mess. You'll walk away clean. But if you stay silent, you'll go down with him." For a long moment, Ivy said nothing. She just stared out the window, her reflection fractured against the glass. Finally, she whispered, "He ruined me too. I thought I was special. I thought he saw me." I nodded slowly. "He fooled both of us. But now we get to decide how his story ends." When she looked back at me, something had changed in her eyes, fear mixed with a strange relief. She agreed to help. Not out of loyalty to me, but out of desperation to save herself. Over the next few days, she handed over documents, messages, and financial records only she could access. Together, we began piecing together the puzzle that would expose him completely. Julian had built his empire on deceit. Now, two women he underestimated were about to turn that deceit into his undoing. The storm finally broke. It started with a single headline: "Brooks Estates under federal investigation." Within hours, every major outlet picked it up. The news spread faster than wildfire, each article feeding off the last: embezzlement, false reports, shell companies missing funds. His name, once dripping with prestige, was now synonymous with scandal. Julian's phone didn't stop ringing. I watched him from across the room as he paced, shouting into one call after another, trying to hold on to the crumbling edges of his empire. His voice cracked with disbelief, with anger, with fear. "That's not true. Tell them it's a misunderstanding," he kept repeating, like a man trying to convince the tide not to rise. Investors started pulling out one by one. Banks froze his accounts. The IRS showed up with questions he couldn't answer. The office that once buzzed with admiration now echoed with silence. His employees vanished overnight, his business partners stopped returning his calls, and the sleek cars in our driveway were towed away one by one. I watched it all unfold in quiet stillness. There was no satisfaction yet, just a calm awareness that everything was happening exactly as it was meant to. Julian's empire had been built on lies, and now the foundation had finally collapsed beneath him. One night, he came home late, his eyes red and sunken, his suit wrinkled. The man who used to walk like he owned the world now moved like a shadow of himself. He slammed the door, throwing papers across the living room. "You did this!" he yelled, pointing at me, his voice trembling with rage. "You and your damn attitude. You've always hated my success." I stood up slowly, setting my cup down on the table. "Julian," I said softly, "I didn't have to do anything. You destroyed yourself." He laughed bitterly, pacing, running his hands through his hair. No. This is too perfect. Someone set me up. You've been acting strange for months, pretending to be the perfect wife. You think I didn't notice?" His voice broke on the last word. I met his gaze, unflinching. "Notice what?" "That I finally stopped begging for scraps of respect." He stared at me, breathing hard, his arrogance collapsing into something raw and ugly. "I've lost everything," he whispered. "Everything I built." I walked closer, slow and deliberate, until we were only a few feet apart. "You once said you'd rather kiss a dog than me," I said quietly. "So I made sure that dog was your last loyal friend." The words hit him harder than any slap could. He froze, the weight of them sinking in. For a moment, he looked like he might say something, an apology maybe, or another insult. But nothing came. He turned away, shoulders slumped, and walked out into the night. I didn't follow. I just watched through the window as he disappeared into the darkness, the echo of his downfall ringing in the silence he left behind. The house was silent now, too silent. No music, no footsteps, no arguments echoing through the marble halls. Just the soft hum of emptiness. Julian had finally moved out. He didn't take much with him, only a few clothes, his watch collection, and whatever pride he had left. The rest, the furniture, the art, the memories, stayed behind, hanging in the air like ghosts that refused to leave. I walked through each room slowly, my fingers tracing the walls we once painted together. The dining room still smelled faintly of wine and candle wax, the same place where he'd humiliated me months ago. The living room, once filled with guests who admired our perfect life, now looked hollow. I stopped by the staircase, the one I'd climbed 1,000 times, both in hope and heartbreak. Now every step felt lighter. There was no triumph in me, no celebration. What filled me instead was a quiet ache, a mourning not for the man he became, but for the version of us that once existed. The laughter, the plans, the late nights dreaming of a future we'd never build. Love had lived here once. So had pain. Now only peace remained. Bo called that afternoon. His voice was calm but warm. "It's all finalized, Amara," he said. "The court recognized your contribution to Julian's assets. You now own several of his properties, including the Midtown office." I closed my eyes for a moment, letting it sink in. Justice didn't always roar. Sometimes it arrived softly, like closure on a breeze. "Thank you, Bo," I said. "For everything." A week later, I visited that office. The same one Julian had used as the command center for his empire. It smelled of cold coffee and failure now. The logo on the glass door still read Brooks Estates. I ran my hand over it before peeling the letters off one by one. In their place, I put up a new name, Ease Interiors. It wasn't just business. It was reclamation. The space he'd filled with arrogance and deceit would now hold creativity, light, and something honest. I opened the blinds, letting the sun spill in, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I could breathe. As I arranged the sample boards and sketches on the desk, I imagined what the future might look like, not built on revenge anymore, but on purpose. My designs would be mine alone, untouched by his shadow. Every color, every detail, every wall would tell my story of rebuilding. Before I left, I looked out the window at the city skyline. Atlanta glowed in the distance, alive, moving forward, unconcerned with the ruins of one man's ego. I smiled faintly and whispered to the empty room, "You took my trust, Julian, but not my vision." Then I turned off the lights and closed the door behind me, leaving the ashes of our marriage exactly where they belonged, in the past. The morning sun spread gold across the Atlanta skyline as Amara leaned back in her chair, a a cup of coffee warming her hands. The terrace outside her office had become her sanctuary. High above the noise, the city buzzing beneath her feet. The air smelled like rain and new beginnings. She closed her eyes for a moment, listening to the soft hum of the world moving on, realizing that she finally had two. Her office behind her was alive with energy. Designers and assistants moved around with purpose, samples spread across tables, laughter drifting through open doors. Ease Interiors was growing faster than she'd ever imagined. Her name, once hidden behind Julian's, now stood proudly on the glass walls. Every project they took on carried her touch, modern, bold, and full of light. Ivy Carver was long gone. After helping expose Julian's fraud, she'd quietly packed up and left Atlanta, chasing anonymity and maybe a bit of redemption. Amara didn't hate her anymore. In some strange, twisted way, Ivy had been part of her awakening. Sometimes betrayal wasn't the end, it was the spark. Julian, meanwhile, was trapped in his own downfall. The lawsuits piled up, the tax investigations deepened, and his name had become a whisper in circles that once worshipped him. Amara didn't follow the news anymore. The victory had come and gone. There was nothing left for her there. The satisfaction she felt wasn't about his ruin, it was about her peace. A soft knock pulled her out of thought. Her new assistant, Mia, stepped out onto the terrace, holding a notepad. "Miss Ease," she said with a shy smile. "The team wants to print a motto for the company brochure. Something that defines what we stand for. Do you have one in mind?" Amara looked out at the skyline again, the city glistening like it had been rebuilt from its own ashes, much like her. She thought about everything that had brought her here. The cruelty, the humiliation, the long nights filled with silent rage, and then the calm power that followed. She turned back to Mia and smiled softly. "Yes," she said. "Tell them our motto is build beauty on broken ground." Mia wrote it down, nodding. "That's powerful," she said before heading back inside. Alone again, Amara exhaled slowly. For the first time, she felt light. Not because the pain had vanished, but because she had stopped carrying it. She took another sip of her coffee and let the warmth settle in her chest. She didn't forgive Julian. She didn't need to. Forgiveness was about them. Peace was about her. She stood, watching the horizon glow brighter with the rising sun. The woman who had once been broken was now whole. The world below kept spinning, but she had found her stillness. And in that quiet moment, Amara smiled. Not as the woman who was betrayed, but as the woman who finally kissed freedom. Do you think Amara was right to let Julian's downfall unfold without ever seeking forgiveness? Or should she have given him another chance to make things right? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd really love to hear your take. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss what's coming next.